So if you've been following my channel for any period of time, you know that I'm a big patch notes guy. I just love reacting and looking at new patches, discussing the good, the bad, the ugly, and maybe just the neutral. And if you had the most recent patch pulled up, you might have noticed that I didn't really give much of a reaction to this patch, not just because there wasn't as much to react to, but also because I wanted to try something a little bit different. What if instead of just providing constructive criticism for patch notes, we actually try to do something better on our own? And now this is obviously coming from somebody that isn't necessarily involved fully in the design scene, just really a spectator's opinion, but it's something that I've really been wanting to do for a long time. I've already done a lot of hero reworks, tank, DPS, and support. I have a lot of opinions about the direction I think Overwatch should go from my opinion, and with the help of Twitch chat this past week, I actually sat down and I fixed the patch, giving feedback about what could have been done better, what things should have been done differently, and maybe giving some insight about why developers did what they did. So the first thing is, like, what is a patch supposed to do? For Overwatch, historically, patch notes are generally focused on making small tweaks or adjustments to address win rates and pick rates for characters that are struggling or overperforming. Now, there's a lot of fair criticism about how this is applied. In the past, especially, there was a lot of indiscriminate buffs and nerfs. In other words, a character is underperforming, they'll buff it even if the character is like really unhealthy for the game, or they'll nerf a character if it's overperforming even if the character is really healthy, like Tracer and Genji constantly receiving nerfs. Genji especially, even though the character is relatively healthy compared to the rest of DPS cast, whereas characters like Orisa and Roadhog have received a lot of unnecessary buffs even when they're underperforming by a little bit. Long story short, we're going to keep that bias in mind, and I think they've done a better job here. My approach to patch notes is that I think that there's going to be a reasonable amount of variety in the meta. I think buffing and nerfing things to mix things up is something that Overwatch should continue to do, and they have confirmed that that is one of the reasons why they release mid-season patch notes. But my additional goal with patch notes, and something that I think Overwatch should be doing a better job of, is trying new little details, little mini reworks over these mid-season patches. I understand that not every character, we don't have the time or the resources to do full reworks of characters that are considered problematic, and that is a whole can of worms, especially considering that a lot of the reworks really haven't done anything at all. But the question was, with just a patch, could you, with some minor tweaks, change fundamentally how a character works for the better for the long term? Some characters just need tweaks, some characters need a lot more than that, and so in today's patch fix, I'm not going to do quotation marks again, I'm sorry, it's just awful. We're going to be trying to actually not just tweak the numbers randomly to a more healthy state, but actually ask ourselves, are there any systemic issues that we can fix without a complete overhaul of the hero kit, even if it's by little bit by little bit? Mauga is a great example of a character that is still pretty rotten to play versus, but over the course of a couple patches has overall improved his playstyle loop significantly. He's still Mauga, he still sucks, but the overall there are a lot of things that they have done over the last year that have improved his gameplay loop by at least a little bit, and this is without any major overhaul to the character. Can we do the same? Well, that's going to be the challenge. So we're going to be going through most of the ones that I think needed to be changed. The ones that I'm not really sure about, we're just going to kind of leave. For example, the Doomfist change, the angle, wall punch, the ultimate cost, the healing per second. I think I've had some thoughts on Doomfist reworks that I think would be fun. A lot of changes to how block works and powered punch, but that's not really the topic for today. So we're just going to leave Doomfist patch notes as is. And I actually think the same thing for Junkrat Queen. I think that Junkrat Queen is definitely an overperforming tank, but she's also a really fun and balanced tank to play, and also very challenging. So I think the nerfs are relatively reasonable, as long as we make sure that she's not getting run over by cheese tanks, which we'll get to in a second. Now, the Mauga change is where we're going to actually start, because this is the one where I think I would have changed just a little bit here. This is going to be leaning into a mini rework, but a rework that I think that can be done by just tweaking numbers for the most part, with a few exceptions. First things first is, what do I feel like Mauga should shift away from into a different hero fantasy? I think the hero fantasy of Mauga is like this crazy psychopathic berserker that just goes in and kills stuff. The miniguns, the way that they function, I think is a large part of the hero fantasy and probably needs to stay intact. But the problem with Mauga is that his sustain and huge, massive hitbox, and actually lack of sustain when he's not healing, is such that you're pretty much not allowed to shoot anything but tank if you want to keep yourself alive in a lot of circumstances. Now, there is reward for the risk with Slam now. The distance is faster, the damage is better, and so on. It's even easier to set squishes on fire, by the way. But there were some questions here. Can we shift some of that attention more into the berserker going for squishies when it is possible to do so? Couple of ideas here. This might just be a straight up worse Mauga, but let me give this a quick disclaimer. With all of these changes for characters that are generally regarded as unpopular or annoying or just not healthy for the game, we are going to be fairly aggressive with those changes. And honestly, I'm unapologetic about it. If this trashes the character's identity, okay, revert it, go back to where we were. But with the character like Mauga, and later we'll talk about Kiriko as well, those characters are so globally unpopular and struggling, underperforming, overperforming, impossible to find that balance, that honestly, you need to take risks. If it's broke, broke, you got to try to fix it, even if you break it again, because the character, you're going to be criticized for taking aggressive changes, but the character is so unpopular as it is, you really don't lose anything. Genji is a great example of a character that really doesn't need a lot of changes, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But for a character like Mauga, you got nothing to lose. So the first thing is we're going to be shrinking the clip significantly. I don't think the gameplay loop of shooting tanks is solely from clip size, but it's definitely enabled a lot by the fact that you just can cheat and shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot. It means that there's no real reload that's relevant in the middle of an engagement. And the big thing that we're going to be doing is focusing on his cardiac overdrive. I think the low cooldown on the run and slam is fine. Maybe it's a little bit overtuned, but whatever. I think it's the more healthy, interesting aspect of his kit. So first thing first is we're going to remove the team lifesteal from the ultimate and the damage reduction completely gone. We're going to force it to be a selfish cooldown. Now, I know some people are going to be like, right, that's the unique aspect of Team Hero Fantasy. It's not healthy from a professional perspective because it leads to a lot of AoE sustained metas, which are really just not good for the game. The other reason is it's just one of the least intuitive and least interesting aspects of the Mauga himself. 99% of the time that you're using cardiac, you're using it for yourself. So even though the aspect of utility is there, it's never really leveraged until it's abused at a professional level, in which case it's just the worst of both worlds. It reminds me a great deal of an original overheat mechanic from Orisa, where you could use Fortify to cool down your overheat or reduce the amount of overheat. It's a cool idea, but it just never really executed that way. And I think anything that encourages AoE sustain, especially in Overwatch 2, just doesn't really work all that much. So I would like to see the lifesteal and damage reduction gone permanently. I would like to see a lower cooldown on cardiac overdrive, because I think it just is too long of a cooldown. It's like this big powerful loop, and that's basically it. And instead, I'd like to see some sustain cooked into the ability that isn't just damage reduction and isn't just personal lifesteal. See, the problem with that is that if you cannot get damage done with cardiac overdrive, and a lot of damage done, usually done by shooting tanks, then it's actually hard to keep yourself alive. Do you guys remember when Overhealth was tied with Mauga cardiac overdrive briefly, and then they had to take it away because too much of his kit was too powerful? I think they need to bring that back, but you need to reduce the amount of personal lifesteal back to a normal thing so that you can actually use cardiac overdrive as an anti-heal defense or just general engagement mitigation that isn't tied directly to self-heal. The goal is to, can we give Mauga self-defense that isn't tied to self-heal strictly? I think in addition to that, you can actually tie some offensive value to the Mauga cardiac overdrive as well by either reducing the time it takes to set somebody on fire, so hey, you can actually burn squishies with cardiac, or maybe even when you pop cardiac, you set fire to people around you for a small DOT. So the uses of this all of a sudden become very interesting, where you can actually use it to set up aggressive plays by immediately allowing you to crit off of engagements, maybe be broken, I don't know, but then also introduces some nuance about how you use it defensively, where maybe it still has some damage reduction involved, but it actually allows you to use it in situations when you don't have to shoot a tank. Essentially, we're taking an ability that is strictly used for Mauga and maybe accidentally for Team 2, still leaving it mostly for Mauga, but all of a sudden we're in a situation where you can actually use it both offensively and defensively, and you don't have to just shoot tanks. It can provide mitigation versus other sources as well. I think reducing the cooldown to 10 seconds and allowing it to toy with some of these numbers could be really interesting. It would allow a more offensive encouraged gameplay loop, which I think would be very interesting for the character, and also allow Mauga to do things besides just shooting tanks. So we're not only nerfing his ability to shoot tanks by a little bit, but we're also opening up offensive opportunities elsewhere. A lot of people in my Twitch chat thought this would be too harsh of a nerf, and I honestly am not really sure. All of this is really just conjecture, and it's impossible to test this without actually testing things, but I'm curious to see at least letting it try to see how it would go. And again, the idea here is that if it burns, if it sucks, we revert it. It's Mauga. We really lose nothing by trying. We don't go as much in detail on the Hanzo one. I think Hanzo one definitely is a more overhaul. Like, he's going to need more of an overhaul and or just leave as is. I think the time to fully charge is a very, very fair buff. It was a horrific quality of life nerf. It felt terrible playing Hanzo. And also, Dragon Strike damaging buildable objects felt like a no-brainer. Feels like it should have been the game 6 years ago, so it's a no-brainer. Hanzo as a whole is definitely a tricking character that probably deserves its own video, but we don't really have time for that today. So if there's no real easy fix or no mini rework that would fix it, then I think we kind of move on. And that's going to lead us on to Junkrat. So this is a really bad nerf. Maybe, honestly, maybe the worst change in the entire match notes from a stylistic standpoint, not in terms of effect. Junkrat was definitely overperforming, but Concussion Mine was not just a combo ability. It was also his ability to disengage and move around. It's probably his most interesting ability, certainly his most interesting ability. And a lot of Junkrat mains are rightfully just unhappy with this nerf when there were other nerfs available. So I'm going to take responsibility for one nerf suggestion or one idea, but then I want to actually shift my perspective away to another Junkrat main in my community who actually had a really good video. I'll post a video, I'll link it in the comments, about what he thinks Junkrat actually needs. My idea is that if we're going to give Junkrat like any nerf, maybe knockback on mine. I know that would throw off muscle memory and follow-ups, but I do find the mine knockback to be probably the most powerful boop in Overwatch right now, and it feels odd to be tied also to a damage source. Even as a tank main, you can be just abused by this ability, even with the boop reduction. But the more important nerfs which were suggested by the Junkrat main was reducing the hitbox on the first bounce on a mine or a grenade. So in other words, you shoot a grenade, it bounces off of a wall. The hitbox should be shrunk on the first bounce, not the second bounce. So essentially, it still rewards skillful bounces, but it makes the random bounce kills happen a lot less frequently. So it's like the cheesier aspect of the character, reducing the hitbox on that by a little bit. And then he actually says as well, the detonation is instant after first bounce if it hits the ground. In other words, if you hit a grenade off of a wall and it hits the ground, it detonates instantly instead of after waiting 0.3 seconds. Again, random RNG kills. So these are more minor nerfs, but they're definitely significant in the global aspect of like just the random kills. But then he's pointed out something else as well, which I actually didn't think about, which is ironic because he actually references my video, which is fixing armor. So if you guys haven't seen that video, I'll post a little video of that right there. It's basically like the solution armor is that the problem is that there's a maximum damage reduction, that armor can only at most reduce your damage by 50%. Like in other words, if armor reduces your damage by 5, Tracer's damage does 5.5, I believe right now. So it's not going to make your damage do 0.5. It's going to be 2.75. And the idea is that it doesn't make armor too effective. But the problem is there's no minimum damage reduction. So very large instances of damage, like for example, Junkrat's Rip Tire, I believe it's 600 damage. It's going to do 595 damage on an armor target. So armor is basically meaningless versus big sources of damage. And that's Junkrat, and that's headshots, and so on. So the problem is that armor can be too effective versus small instances of damage, which was intentional for dealing with tank busters, but it needs a minimum threshold, and it doesn't have that right now. And from what I heard from all the backseat programmers in my Twitch chat, it's pretty easy to code. My suggestion would be something like a 10 or 15% minimum. So if you hit a Hanzo headshot, it's reduced by 10%, not 5. If you hit a Junkrat grenade, it's hit by 10%, not 5. And I think that was the big problem with Junkrat is he's really, really good at tank busting because of armor's current iteration. The old iteration of 30% was arguably a little bit too strong, and it definitely enabled tank busters too much. But the current iteration of armor is very good versus tank busters, which is good, but very bad versus heavy, high projectile damage characters, which is very bad. And I think that there needs to be some sort of middle ground. Now, this would be a buff to armor, so you'd have to tweak the numbers elsewhere. Like maybe you reduce the maximum threshold, so the maximum threshold instead of 50% is 40%. Maybe some heroes have less armor, but I feel like this is just such a no-brainer that it's actually affecting other characters in the game, like Junkrat. It's just a no-brainer fix to me. We're not going to talk as much about Reaper. I think nerfing his self-sustain is probably the most important thing. I think some people in chat were also saying, like, why does he have 300 HP now that he's not as much of a tank buster? He has a little bit more range, a little bit more mobility options with teleport. I think that's reasonable as well. But Lifesteal being the first thing to go seems very reasonable to me. And I think, obviously, like I said, moving from there, we can cross that road. Tracer as well, no big deal. Tracer bounces back and forth a lot depending on the environment surrounding her. And right now, the environment surrounding her has been very toxic. And so that now she's kind of struggling. And so changing recall from 13 to 12 is fine. I think Ana is mostly fine. There's definitely some issues maybe with Sleep Dart and Nade still. I think Nade specifically. But again, not a huge priority for right now. I think the Juno nerf is also fair. And I want to focus mostly on a couple of last changes here, which are going to be Kiriko. So Kiriko, we cooked a little bit, and this is going to be Mauga 2.0, where we're really going to be applying ourselves to try some new things with Kiriko, because basically every aspect of her kit right now, with like the exception of wall climb, is hugely unpopular from people that dislike Kiriko. Like when I did a most hated hero, I was surprised at how many people actually hated Kiriko, despite the fact that she's been like chronically underperforming for like the last year. So she was really, really strong in the initial Overwatch release and has been strong for a while, or was strong for a while, and then got pretty hard nerfed over time, and is a great example of a character that is over-tuned but underperforms chronically. I almost considered doing a full video on this, but I think we'll just kind of throw it in here right now. So the question is why do people cake this character so much? Teleport is a get out of jail free card. Suzu does too many things at once. Kitsune is very strong. Her damage is very spammy. She can put out a lot of healing. Her utility is actually kind of low, and also when she's sitting in the backline, she's one of the weakest supports in the game. I think that's where maybe the impression from Kiriko is wrong, where clearing clearing Kiriko out of an angle, even if you don't get the kill, is so incredibly valuable, but it doesn't feel like that, right? Ana, Zenyatta, Baptiste, even at times Brigitte are all characters that do better when they're playing on main in terms of sustained damage, controlling space, and utility. But Kiriko, clearing a Kiriko on an angle and forcing her to play on main just doesn't feel like a very healthy or fun gameplay loop. So what we did is we actually went in a different direction I think people are going to expect. We didn't just nerf Kiriko, like you can't teleport through walls, or you do less healing, or your damage is less spam it, because again, the character is already underperforming. What we try to do first, or what I try to do first, is try to give her some utility elsewhere, give her more dials to turn so that we could nerf the obnoxious aspects of her kit without gutting the character. So I'm going to cook a little bit here. What are aspects in Kiriko's kit that are just underutilized or just really not thoughtful? And actually the first thing I came up to was her healing, which is 5 Ofuda resource based, but it's just completely irrelevant in reality. I had people going in chat, actually, nerd emoji, as if I had to clarify that. Actually, you can cancel your healing midway through and then do damage. It's like, bro, the amount of times where that's actually irrelevant, as somebody that's coached bronze Kiriko and literally top 500 Overwatch League Kiriko before, it doesn't matter. It's just a completely worthless aspect. Even the heal over time aspect, like in other words, it's the travel time, right? Pre-healing. I actually see more bronze and silver players more concerned about pre-healing than top 500 players. It's just not all that useful most of the time in most circumstances. It's mostly just kind of a aspect of the kit that's never really utilized or explored. Comparing that to, for example, wall climb for Genji, it doesn't matter. Wall climb significantly affects how Genji is played, whereas the Afuda's 5 resource and then pre-healing, it doesn't really change the gameplay loop, nor does it introduce any sort of decision making with Kiriko. So my question was, could we introduce some utility or interesting aspects to Kiriko so that we have other things that we can tweak? And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with buffs to Kiriko. So hang tight with me. So the first thing here, well, this is a buff or a nerf. Again, the numbers here are just completely experimental. Let me know what you think. So a Fuda resource is tweaked to function like Doomfist weapon. In other words, it's a slowly recharging resource, okay? We can maybe talk about ways to recharge that, but for right now, it's just the recharge resource. Like let's say every 4 or 5 seconds, she gets another heal. And there's only 3 of them, and they regenerate every 4 or 5 seconds. Currently, right now, Kiriko does 130 healing for a full clip of a Fuda. So the numbers of healing would remain the same. However, instead of it being 130 healing direct, it's 80 healing direct for the full set of Ofuda. You can't selectively apply papers, okay? And then it's 50 healing over time over 3 seconds. So kind of similar to how Moira sprays functions right now, but crucially applied at a much longer range and maybe even a stronger heal over time. So what this means is now you have a heal over time that can be applied. Now, heal over time is a very important topic because what it does is it's generally one of the healthier expressions of sustain in the game, because a lot of it is preventative or anticipation. And in addition to that, it introduces a level of strategy where, because you can apply a heal to a target that's not currently taking damage. You want to talk about actually making pre-healing relevant? Applying a small heal over time on a target, that's where pre-healing is relevant. That's something that you see with Zenyatta's Harmony Orb, you see that with Brigitte's Armor Packs, and even occasionally with Moira's Healing Spray, because healing over time becomes almost an anticipation of threat and damage to come. It's not just heal creep like burst healing is. And that's where pre-healing becomes very interesting. But the problem is you only have 3 heals that recharge. So the question is I could drop that in tank, you're going to get full value, but could you drop that in DPS that's currently taking a duel or an angle? That becomes very important as well. But let me cook, because we're not done yet. Because now healing a Fuda also applies a 10% attack or a movement speed. We haven't decided yet which, that's kind of up in the air. Applies a 10% buff to your attack speed or your movement speed. So now it's not just about the healing value, but it's also about the buff that you're applying, the temporary buff that lasts during the heal over time, 3 seconds, to the target. So now do you heal your tank, who then gets the movement speed or the attack speed, or do you heal your DPS, or do you peel for somebody who now can attack or move faster as a result of that peel, right? We're talking about a single target speed that's broadly applicable. Now, I know speed is a very tricky utility to utilize, but that's exactly why we're doing it. It's something that's going to actually take a lot of skill to apply with the Kiriko. It's also because you don't have as much spamming heal, it reintroduces a type of utility that hasn't really been relevant to Kiriko for a long time, which is weaving. So if you guys are familiar with Baptiste, talk about damage, heal, damage, heal, damage, heal. Very important gameplay loop, and it's very fluid with Baptiste because of how this weapon works. With Kiriko, the weaving is just not as useful because you're usually either healing from an angle and shooting frontline, which is not as strong as it is with Baptiste, or you're on an angle dueling. It's very difficult to weave with Kiriko's weapon with the positions and the playstyle that she does, but now if you only have 3 resource, you not only have more time to be able to weave, but you also have more relevance with weaving. So you can be a heal there, do some damage. Okay, that's a heal there, and do some damage. The weaving aspect of Kiriko feels a lot more natural to her encouraged gameplay loop. More buffs. TP, when you teleport, the Kiriko herself gains faster attack or movement speed. Again, I'm not really sure here. You could argue attack for offensive teleports. You could argue movement speed, but I'm scared that that would mean too easy disengages. But nerf to teleport is that the range is reduced by anywhere from 10 to 20 meters when you don't see the target. So you can still teleport through walls. I have seen some people say you shouldn't be able to teleport through walls at all. I think that would be pretty rough. But you can't teleport near as far. So it's much easier to punish. You have to be a lot more selective, and you have a lot of Kirikos trying to teleport through walls and failing. So you can still teleport a long distance as long as you can see the target. But if you can't, it's significantly cut, maybe even half, okay? But when you do teleport, you're actually able to get some sort of offensive value either through movement speed and attack speed. Now, this is crucial because now you talk about the essential gameplay loop where you're on an angle, you teleport to safety. You're on an angle, you teleport to safety. Now, offensive teleports actually occasionally make sense because there is an offensive reward, whether it's through the attack speed or the movement speed, for teleporting. You can actually go in and probably not always feed. It's not usually going to be the plan, but it's an actual nuance that's just not there with Kiriko right now because every time you teleport, you're vulnerable. Well, what if you're vulnerable? You actually have a bonus. That's something that we're looking into here, but it gets deeper. One more layer here. So we talk about what Suzu does. We talks about the invulnerability, the targets are not killable. Intangibility, the target's a ghost, you essentially go right through them. Burst, heal, and cleanse. People were saying remove the intangibility. So in other words, you can hit the target. The vulnerability is there, but you can hit the target. It's very important for a lot of hero interactions and has a significantly weaker burst heal on cleanse. So it does less healing and does not grant intangibility. But Suzu now grants either movement or attack speed. You're noticing a pattern here, right? Teleport with Kiriko grants it. Healing grants it. Suzu grants it. I think probably having 2 out of the 3 grant 1 and then Suzu grants the opposite would be very interesting. Now, this is important because when you do Suzu this way, you now have a buff that is useful even when targets are not 1 HP. You understand? So right now, Suzu is essentially used as a save the target kind of situation. Suzu could still be used this way. But when you tie a movement or attack speed boost to it, I might be Suzing my Ryan at half HP so that he's able to do more with that, right? And crucially as well, he's not intangible. He can still be booped, right? So it essentially removes a lot of the kit bloat, just free value from the Kiriko Suzu, and introduces value, but a different type of value. So that actually makes you have to make a choice. You could Suzu yourself, but man, that buff would have been really nice for somebody else, right? You could Suzu your Ryan when he's 1, but what if you Suzu your Ryan earlier? Maybe he never would have even been 1. Maybe you could have done something with that. What if you don't even Suzu your Ryan? What if you Suzu your Genji? And what could he do with that, right? So these are questions that I want answered. Like, what if you gave this type of utility to Kiriko with all of her abilities? Now we actually have a choice. Like, this would be, even if you don't necessarily agree with the direction of this, my one challenge for you is if you don't agree with it, I'm not arguing that this would be balanced and perfect and would be perfect as is. This is just completely conjecture without actually trying any of this. But wouldn't you be interested to see how Kiriko would play? Wouldn't you be interested to see how the character would feel? How the gameplay loop might be more dynamic and more interesting? Don't you think that you'd be making more decisions than you are currently right now with Kiriko? And again, this is coming from somebody that's coached Kiriko hundreds of times for all ranks, right? So I'm curious to see what you guys think of this one. A lot of people were like, maybe this is just too complicated. My argument would be that this character is already complicated. We've had different crit multipliers. We've had weaving in the character that was not only unintuitive, but a bit awkward. And heck, we've had Suzu have 4 aspects, none of which were particularly intuitive outside of the cleanse. And now this is just down to 3. So is there complexity here? I guess, but it doesn't feel particularly more complicated than the Kiriko that we've had already. So I don't think that's a good argument in and of itself. So I'm curious what you guys think. We're going to keep moving on here. Again, we're cooking here with those characters because those characters are so historically hated, unpopular, and underperforming. So something has to change. You have really nothing to lose here. And I think that we're able to maintain the character's identity while we're doing that at the same time. Really quick, I almost forgot here. I know some people are suggesting with teleport that teleport needs a wind-up time. No, I really disagree. I think it's too slow, too clunky. Wouldn't work in actuality. This responsiveness of teleport being immediate is very important to the character's identity and for the character to work. I would not like to see that change involved in the game. I could be proven wrong, maybe with some testing, but I don't think that that's the play here. Lifeweaver. I actually like the direction they've been going with Lifeweaver recently. I think they've taken a character whose hero fantasy feels very messy, and they've done a pretty good job of implementing some new things to him. I'm a little concerned a little bit with a little bit of the healing creep here. I don't think it's a major healing creep. I understand what they're trying to do with the Tree of Life, which we're allowing you to leave the range of the Tree of Life and still have impact rather than just you have to stay near the Tree of Life. But I had some ideas here. I would love, my number one suggestion, and this is something I've suggested before, is I love it that if you used Life Grip on targets that are above 75 HP, it reduces your cooldown of Life Grip by half. So you can actually use Life Grip to reposition people and not just to bail people out of jail. So this introduces some dynamics and nuance to the character so you're able to use it more offensively. Now, you're like, well, wouldn't that just give them 2 Life Grips a fight? Not really, because if you're using an ultimate and you're pulling somebody before that ultimate hits, you're not going to have the second Life Grip by the time that ultimate ends. The ultimate's going to finish, start and finish before you get your Life Grip again. So it's not going to be something you can just pull somebody twice out of a Dragon Blade or a Grav. It's not going to work like that. But what it will do is it will encourage you to look for opportunities to reposition people, and then you are going to have a window of vulnerability, but you'll still be able to have a Life Grip maybe when you need it to get somebody out of jail free. Again, I'm just looking for more opportunities to use Life Grip in different ways. I think maybe the Tree of Life change is okay. Maybe if you're going to allow it to last longer, maybe reduce the amount of HP that the tree has or the healing burst amount. And for an additional bonus, I would like them to continue to tweak down the weapon swap. I tried this in the practice range just a little bit more. It still feels like the weapon swap between healing and damage takes a little bit too long, so that might be something worth putting time into. Finally, last thing, and this one was maybe the most challenging one because we're always asking, like, what can you actually tweak with Moira, because the character just stinks from top to bottom. And I had the suggestion of maybe increasing the range on her primary fire healing so that you can actually apply a little bit of healing or heal over time from distances that you are not. That would be a good way of introducing some interesting decisions with how you position without necessarily breaking her healing, because you don't want to buff her damage, you don't really want to buff her HP, you don't really want to buff her healing output, and you don't want to buff orbs really, or coal. But somebody in my Twitch chat I think had an even better solution for allowing Moira to have a little bit of impact split from her, and again, to introduce more decisions and more choices to make a more brainful, for lack of a better term, character. And their suggestion was, could we increase the Moira orb speed? So as it is right now, here, I believe it's 20 meters per second, something increasing that to like 25 or 30. Now it does slow down when it's on a target, and I think that we keep that slowed down speed. I think it's 5.5 or something like that. But if you allow orb to travel faster on releasing your hand, you're going to be able to have impact with both healing and damage, and locations that right now you aren't really able to, because by the time that orb gets there, usually that person has left, or maybe they've disengaged or avoided, or maybe the person's already dead if you're trying to heal somebody. But you could actually have a situation where heal orbs become more relevant on different angles because the orbs actually travel faster. And so what this does is this doesn't make Moira easier to play. It isn't just power creep flat out. It's about going, okay, this character's underperforming. What is an aspect of the character is really bad at? And that introduces more choice. And that's applying enough controlling pressure from range. Can we homogenize it? Will it be homogenizing this character if we do that? I don't think so. The character's still going to be significantly worse in all ranged options, but now you at least have a choice or an option, and introduces a lot of skill play involved in there. So not sure how that would look in execution, but I think it's certainly worth trying, and I think it's probably one of the most skillful, if not the most skillful aspect that you could buff Moira with. Anyway, that's a long talking, a lot longer than I wanted it to, but the idea here is, again, to add and address things from a patch notes perspective. I'm not gonna lie with you guys, I don't expect the developers to be doing all of this in one patch. What I would say is you would do either the Kiriko or the Mauga one, or maybe even the Junkrat one in one patch and then move on from there. But I think it is important that over time, we are fixing some of the more problematic characters in Overwatch, introducing more skill play, more choices. You're never going to make Moira an Ana. You're never going to make a character like Mauga become a Winston, right? There's still going to be those characters. But I think you can significantly improve their identity and at least increase the skill floor, raise the value floor as well. Because the thing is like, I want to play the Mauga that I tweaked here. I'd want to try that. I want to play that. I want to play the Kiriko ideas. I would want to play Lifeweaver more if I could grip people more often. And so to me, that's like the big thing, is just like not just making the characters more honest, but also making them more enjoyable, more rewarding to play. Because I feel like that's the problem with a lot of these characters and why they're not popular, even when they're relatively strong, is because they're just not all that fun to play. Love to see that change without destroying the hero identity. Let me know what you guys think in the comments.